legal things that you should consider if you're implementing one. And then we'll look at, what types of things you consider if you're reassessing an existing fee, the types of things you should look out for, maybe the drivers for doing so, and then wrap up with some closing thoughts. So one of the first questions you always get from a community that doesn't have one is like, is a stormwater utility right for me? And a lot of folks think, oh, my community's too small, I may not need that. I think that's probably a bit of an old question these days, but still comes up once in a while. But if you're interested in looking at a lot of statistics about stormwater utilities and what types of communities have them, a great resource is the Western Kentucky University Stormwater Utility Survey. They update this annually as a research project. So the latest update was back in 2025. And so these days they estimate there's about 2,100 or more stormwater utilities throughout the United States, and including 43 states. And they range in all different sizes there. So you can see the smallest one out there is in Florida, Indian Creek Village, and the largest one is in Los Angeles. Um, quick note, does anybody know where Indian Creek Village is? Anybody know what that is? Actually had the pleasure of working on that one. It is an island off the coast of Miami, and it's called Baker. And some of the residents are Mark Zuckerberg's there now. Jeff Bezos has a home there, and the Ivanka and Jared Kushner have a home there. And just like everywhere else, guess what they do? They complain about their stormwater fee. So I thought that's pretty interesting. Um, but stormwater utilities these days, a median population for utilities out there, but 16,000. So again, that pretty much covers any of your MS4 communities. If you're not considering one at this point, you're probably a bit behind the eight ball on with your peers. So what's the first step in the process when you're thinking about going down this path? I think one of the main things is identify the drivers for the program. So we'll talk a little bit about how to do that, but it shouldn't just be about we need to have one or we need to raise more money. What is the real driver for the program? What is the thing that's a sticking point that's causing an issue? Or do you think their customers are asking for that needs to do that? And then you got to identify all the types of services you're providing for your program, estimate the cost of what those things provide, because typically if you don't have a stormwater utility, you can't go to your budget and point to one line item that tells you how much you're spending on stormwater. You got to do a little bit of digging to figure out what that cost really is. And lastly, as I alluded to, is what are the benefits gained by that? Because you're not gaining any benefits that you can convey to the public, it's going to be difficult to sell the value of it. So this is typically done in most communities through some kind of feasibility study. So walking through all these types of things with your communities, these are truly unique to every city. There's not that this each city doesn't have the same driver for why they're doing these things. They don't have the same customer base. They don't have the same flooding and water quality issues. So it's really helpful to get your arms around all of this information before you ever venture out to the public to try to sell this to the public as the right approach for your community. And so one of the things that we've learned over the years of doing these is you got to think about how you're going to communicate this stuff to the public or to your elected officials once you get to that point. And so we really like to break the stormwater programs down into more of these functional areas with terms that people maybe understand a bit more. If they don't understand what stormwater management is, they understand what some of these terms are and can start to identify with what your challenges are. So we really look at these four areas of your program. One, program management. That's really the leadership piece, if you will. So it's maybe a portion of the public works director's time or the city engineer, or maybe you have a stormwater engineer that's running your program. Maybe you have some planning efforts that you do that would fall in that program management category. The second is regulatory compliance. I think most of us understand what that is, but that's your MPDS program. But if you go out and say, we have to do an MPDS MS4 permit, the public doesn't necessarily understand that. But if you say we have regulatory requirements that we have to follow and it costs us X, this is what they think they understand. Operation and maintenance, that's probably what the public recognize mostly about your program is the people they see out in the street cleaning drains, cutting ditches, those kinds of things. So that's the O&M side. I think that most people understand that. And lastly, it's the capital improvement. So the larger projects, the big culvert upgrades, neighborhood drainage system upgrades, stream restoration, those sorts of things. Your big projects that you're setting aside money for in the budget and the capital program of the city to do, that falls in this fourth category. So you'll see these four things kind of flow throughout our presentation here, and that's really the approach we use to categorize and consolidate the types of things that are happening in your stormwater program, so that when we get to the part where we have to go to the public, we feel like they better understand what you're facing. So as I kind of mentioned before, in most cities, you don't have a stormwater utility, but some, even if you do, the service that you provide from a stormwater perspective don't necessarily sit in one department. They don't sit in one consolidated unit. They tend to be spread around. And so the ones on the right here are what we see as typically where stormwater services sit. So again, your boots on the ground folks are more often than not, they're in the public works department. Oftentimes they're in the streets division, or it's some crew within the streets division that does the drains while the other guys are doing paving and those sorts of things. Um, Maybe in your public utilities department, or you're sharing staff with your water and wastewater folks. Greenway maintenance, those kinds of things may fall in parks and rec. And then in the engineering side, you may have aspects. So we'll talk here in a minute about how we find those things, but we tend to see those things spread around. So you really got to, again, wrap your hands around what are we doing, where are we doing it, how much does it take to do it, and then we can start to see, what is it, how does that impact our program? But then there's also could be other things out there, like we always talk about the fire department. Maybe they're doing closing down streets when you have a flood. So there's other roles happening in these other departments, but we really see, most of the most of the program activities are in one of those four categories on the right. So, so as a consultant, coming into a community, we don't necessarily know where all those things are, but really your staff are the ones that have this knowledge. And so most of these feasibility study processes really start with a workshop with staff. And so we would come and do a presentation like this, kind of educate everyone overall on what the whole project is. But ultimately, there's a process of sitting down with staff, department by department, and talking about what types of services they provide in their department, what types of staff and equipment are being utilized to provide those services. How effective are they? Are they behind all the time? Do they feel like they're getting ahead? Do they feel like they can ever respond to things? So what are the things that are challenges for them? And then also, what is the wish list? What would you need in order to improve your service? Because when we go out to do these things, more often than not, it's not a case where you're just replacing the funding and you're not improving the level of service. If you start charging customers a fee, they're going to expect to see an increased level of service. So if that's the driver, what do staff think is necessary in order to provide a higher level service, to get to those catch basins more frequently, do more culvert improvement projects? So what is it going to take to do that? Those are the things, spend a lot of time in understanding, so that when we get out to the public and we're talking about the benefits and the costs, we have a good handle on where that sits. But then it's really diving back into the budget. Where do those pieces that the staff identify, where do they actually fall in the line items in the budget? Because ultimately, if you're going to replace some of those costs in your general fund, where are we pulling them out of, or where are we transferring money to? Need to identify all those things. So a lot of that is internal information, that staff have, and so there's a lot of time spent working on that and figuring out where those costs are. And here's kind of an example coming out of that, what that might look like. So when you go from what we talked about, those four categories before, and then we talk about on the left here, the various departments and line items in the budget, and then the costs here over on the right. So in this case, it's a community in Tennessee, had about maybe 40 to 50,000 people population. And so ultimately, we concluded they were spending about $1 million, down in the right-hand corner, about $1 million annually on stormwater, but it was broken up through all these departments and under these categories. So up in the top left, at 25,000, in this case, it was a percentage of the public works director or the engineering manager's time that we fell under program management. Just like moving down in the public works side, percentage of the public works director's time, maybe it's 5 or 10% of his week he's spending on stormwater. Where you move over to the right, you're kind of seeing things like, the NPDES compliance is that stormwater line item. That's where it sat in their budget. So that's all kind of in the regulatory piece. moving over to operation and maintenance, you can see where they came out of the public works labor, maintenance and materials. So the place where you'd expect to find them, but they roll up on their O&M. And then lastly, on the capital side. And so one thing to consider there is really diving into a couple years of budgets to find that number, because a lot of cases, if you don't have a utility in place, you're not regularly spending large money on capital. Maybe if you just looked at last year's budget, maybe there was 500,000 in there last year, but if you looked at the prior 5 years, maybe they didn't do any capital projects. So really look to annualize that. And what do they spend over a typical 5 year period and kind of put that, what does a typical year look like? So in this case, that was about $1 million, but that established, hey, here's the cost of the program today. What are we getting for that? And so that leads into the level of service discussion. And we spent a lot of time here because this is where you're ultimately going to be communicating back to the public. What are they getting out of this service for the $1 million in this case that we're spending? And a lot of elected officials, if they're against kind of doing this, they may ask, well, what's the minimum that we have to do? What's the least amount we can spend on this? And in the stormwater world, there's not a lot, right? Over on the right-hand side is really what you're looking at. It's really your MPDS program. Maybe you're dealing with some impaired waters that you have to address, doing stream walks and those kinds of things. But that's really all the regulatory minimum. Everything else here on the left-hand side, what you do for flood protection, safety, dealing with erosion control, those are really level of service discussions because nobody's mandating that you do any of that. It's really a customer request. And that's unlike a lot of other programs that you may experience in your community. The water, wastewater, there's a lot more regulatory drivers. So a lot of the discussion tends to be around, all right, well, here's these other things that the public's asking for, and they want to see an increased level of service. It's going to cost more money. How are we going to pay for that? And that's where the big crux of these projects is identifying what that is, what the public really wants to see, and then communicating why we may need to fund it in a different way. And if you can't answer those questions, I think it's really hard to get these things approved. So we tend to communicate this through this matrix that we've developed over the years. I remember working on this way back, like I was mentioning, our City of Raleigh project in the early 2000s was where we kind of started doing this. But it's really provided a framework for us, again, to communicate this back to the public at a later date, but we consolidate it with staff early on. And so, again, here's our 4 categories again across the top. There's a level of service score on the left-hand side. Sometimes we use A through F, sometimes 1 through 5. It can depend on how sensitive folks are to getting a D or an F, which is a lot of places where people start if they don't have a well-funded program. But really, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but to understand this, it's really a scale of being reactive to proactive. So on the bottom, if you look at the first category, no planning, we don't have a CIP, we can't implement anything. That's kind of a completely reactive program. If the emergency comes up, we can address it. Otherwise, we can't do anything. We move up to the top. We've planned out everything. We've done an asset management program. We know what all our priorities are. That's kind of the Cadillac scale. And so it really works that way across the board here. And but having used this matrix with a lot of different communities, 100 plus communities now, we have a lot of metrics on how much is the cost to provide a certain level of service? What kinds of things do you do within each box to improve the level of service? So it can look at some metrics and benchmarking community size and those sorts of things to give folks a sense of, all right, well, if we want to be similar to our peers, what might that look like from a cost perspective? But in this community here, these highlighted boxes are where we thought they were. So they were not too much a little bit of planning, but we really hadn't gotten very far. They were permit compliant. They do some inspections in the field when they do their O&M, but it's mostly still just responding to calls. And then over on the right, which is where most people are, is they don't have a well-funded capital program if they don't have a dedicated revenue stream. So the next thing is, all right, well, how do we move up that scale? And so I mentioned some of it, depending on how much information the community have, some of it's just we can use metrics to figure out what those higher scales are for on a per capita basis or per mile of roadway or per mile of pipe that you might have. But in most cases, going through those interviews with staff, we can get a sense of, all right, well, if you have on the O&M side, if you have a 4-person crew that's doing X miles of pipe a year, but you want to do twice that, well, you need an 8-person crew. What does that cost? And how does that move up your level of service? On the capital side, pretty easy to look at that. what's our long-term need? How much do we have to spend per year to get through all those projects? So again, we kind of create this scale of, here's where the program is today for the current level of service you have. What's it going to cost to move up the ladder? And at some point, you're going to reach a point where, hey, it's going to cost more than what the public's willing to accept or willing to spend. Um, but this is a real world example. This one I was mentioning, they were spending about $1 million, and it's like, all right, if you go up to level service three, you're going to have to spend another 500,000 a year to do that. Level four, you're really doubling the size of your program. So those are the kinds of things we can think about as we're deciding what's appropriate and where we're going to fund it. But when you're talking about those decisions, a lot of that stuff can be discussed internally. What are the things that staff think are important? What do elected officials think are important? But ultimately, the public's going to pay that fee. So what do they think is important? How are we going to determine that? So there's various ways that you might do that. It might be information you already have, or you may need to do additional study to figure out what those things are. These are just a few examples here. Over on the left, when we were working with the city of Kingsport, they did some preliminary master planning when they did that utility to really to understand what their capital needs were because they didn't know what those were at the time. They had a good handle on the other things. So that was one thing that they did in parallel to the utility to understand that. In the middle is some data from City of Memphis when they were reassessing their stormwater utility. A lot of it was kind of what have you done for me lately kind of questions from the council. We this is so this chart here is a heat map of the complaints they got. So the dark blue areas are where they got more complaints. The red dots are where they did projects. So it was like, all right, are we doing projects in the right places or do we need to do more projects? Those kinds of things. So you're looking at the data that they already had to understand how they were doing and if they needed to do more. And then over on the right is, just an example of an asset management program. So I think you're really in a great place if you've done some asset management to really know what your needs are, both short term and long term, and use that to guide where spending should take place and where it may need to increase. So those are just some things to think about. It's kind of a chicken and the egg sometimes. It's like, do we have that information going into the utility study, or do we need the utility in order to pay for that to figure out what we need to do in the longer term? So those are a lot of discussions we have with folks and when they're thinking about this. But the next step is, well, how do you pay for it? And I use this, or not how you pay, how you get the support for it. And this, I use this slide. My old mentor uh, shared this a long time ago and used it. So if you've seen him, you may have seen this slide. But really, what we hear a lot of is, how much are these stormwater fees going to be? It's like, oh, it's only $5 a month. It's like it's just a cup of coffee. But it's really when you get to the public and it's in a place where they don't want to pay these fees, how do you sell it to them? You could say this shoe's only $1, but if somebody doesn't want the shoe, it doesn't matter how cheap it is. And so what we really got to get to a point on the messaging side is what are the benefits of the thing that of the thing that we're going to be charging maybe more money for, and is that of value to you, and where's the value proposition? So that's really the big thing, the hurdle to get over on the public acceptance side is the service something the public wants, and how much are they willing to pay to get that service? And if they're not, then maybe that's a lower fee, or maybe we don't do it at all. So um, one of the ways that we do that is through a stakeholder process. And so I would say in a decade ago, most utilities probably went through this kind of public stakeholder process to get set up. I'd say nowadays it's not as common. It really depends on the size of the community and maybe the politics of the community. Most of the time going in, staff and city manager, they already have a sense of who is or isn't supportive of this on the city council. So if you're looking at a 3-4 or 4-3 vote, I would say you may want to think about a more robust public education and outreach process to build that public support. And we found the most successful way to do that is through a stakeholder process. And in this case, we'd get together, whether it's 10, 15, maybe probably no more than 20 people in your community of various groups to go through a process of educating them on what is the city doing now, what does it cost to do that, what are some of the drivers for doing more or doing things differently, and really everybody having a say in what that may look like. And maybe one of the scarier parts of that for some folks is, well, you're giving up some control of the outcome, right? Because as you get this community together and they don't support it, then maybe you're at a crossroads. But in the vast majority of the projects I've been involved in, um, this process is great for getting folks on board with understanding what the challenges of your staff are. So it's not just staff complaining they need more money. The public understands what that is. I mean, some of the keys to making sure that process goes well. One is inviting all stakeholders. So this is the age-old adage of keep your friends close and enemies closer. I wouldn't just stack the deck and include people that you know are friendly to your program. I would absolutely include people that are adversaries or that maybe don't agree with what you're doing, or development community, what have you, that are opposed to some of these new fees. And if nothing else, understand what their hot button items are so that when you get to the end, there's not a surprise about what they walk in the room at your council meeting when you're trying to have a vote and you hear something you never heard of before. But a lot of times what I find is they tend to gain an appreciation of what your challenges are, what the needs that you're trying to meet are, and they might not like what you're doing and they may not ultimately vote for what you're doing, but they at least understand and have a better sense of where things are going. But you're going to want to identify, significant groups in the city. So, it's nonprofits, schools, large businesses, residents, of course, environmental groups. So those kinds of groups that have varying opinions that you want to educate and ultimately get their support. I mentioned highlighting the needs and benefits. We always start with service and needs. If you start talking about fees first, it usually fails. So really have people understand what are the needs of the program, what are the benefits it's going to provide, and then we talk about how much it's going to cost and whether you're willing to pay for it. But the other thing I would say is it takes more investment and time to do this, but I would say if you rush through this process, if you go down this path, if people feel railroaded by it, they won't support it. So, we set up, it's maybe 5 or 6 meetings at least to kind of walk through all these stages that we're going through today in this hour and really dive deep into these things. If you go in there and say, "Hey, we're going to just do 2 or 3 meetings and get this done," and they think that you're going into it with a foregone conclusion of the outcome, they don't buy in. So I really think you need to make, if you go down the path of a stakeholder group, you need to make sure to leave the time to do it properly. I was going back to my old Raleigh example that I was mentioning, and I probably went into that as a young engineer skeptical about like, oh, we're going to charge people more money for something they don't need to, they don't think they need to pay for. Like that's never going to work, right? Um, but seeing the process play out, and back in that time, we were really looking at 3 different categories. So this is our matrix, but just program management, O&M, and capital. But anyway, uh, in this case, Raleigh was spending about $6.5 million a year on their stormwater program. And ultimately, what the committee voted for was to double the size of the program to 12 million, understanding that it was going to be a new fee, twice as much cost as it was before. But if you look at the voting there, we had 22 people on our committee. In that first category as they voted, no one voted to keep the program where it was, even understanding that it was going to cost more money. But most people voted for the A or B level program, which ultimately ended up costing about $12 million. And so that was kind of an eye opener for me going through that process to go, all right, well, if you educate people and again, they may not like everything about what you're doing, but they understand what the benefits are, they may be willing to pay a little bit extra to get that benefit for their community. And that was a success story. And if you're ever interested in reading more about it, there's a good write-up of it in the WEF Stormwater Utility Manual, which I'll highlight a little bit later. There's lots of case studies in there if you want to see how other programs have done this. Well, like I said, not every city requires that, and you really need to tailor that public outreach effort for what your community needs. I'd say just in my recent experience in Tennessee, the last 4 or 5 that we've worked on didn't really require that robust stakeholder effort. There was already, kind of an understanding that this is the path that the city was going to go down. But at the same time, you really need to educate the community on what you're doing, the timeline of what you're doing, how much it's going to cost. Um, not only just for the residents, which is one set of folks, which do kind of see that $4 or $5 charge, which at the end of the day causes questions, but not as much angst as some others. Um, but really, it's kind of those targeted outreach groups I was mentioning. So obviously educating city council throughout the process on what you're doing, chambers of commerce so the businesses know what's coming. And in the case of Gallatin, there was their industrial development board, which had they have a lot of industry and large properties with large impervious areas. So we had dedicated meetings with those groups on an individual basis in some cases, but also as a group to tell them exactly what their fee was going to be, when it was going to be implemented, what were their opportunities for credits that we could get in place before the fee ever got issued, just to give them a comfort level of understanding what it was and the timing of it. I think that's one just quick comment on that is a lot of times with, from the city staff, you're working through the budget process. It always seems to make sense to implement a new fee July 1. Well, think about your customer base and these large industries that they budget on an annual basis, January to December. So they hate mid-year changes in cost. And so a lot of times while you may approve it at a July 1, through the budget process. I would strongly consider not implementing the fee till January 1. So you have that next 6 months to educate everybody on what they're going to do so they have less heartburn about it. So we talked a lot about service, as I mentioned, and that's really what we always recommend focusing on services and costs of the program. But you're ultimately identifying a gap to go from where you are today to where you want to go in the future. So that's really what that next question is like, how are we going to fund the future program? Um, Ultimately, it could just be we're going to raise taxes and we're going to pay for that through the general fund like we always have. That could be a reasonable answer. Um, but the two things you're going to consider is we're going to keep doing status quo and raise the rates, raise taxes, or we're going to go to this user fee program. So we're going to kind of move to that. But those are the kind of two primary things we usually end up debating. There are also these secondary funding grants and bonds and special assessment, all those kinds of things, but they typically can't fund your whole program. They tend to be just a part of your program. A lot of times those things are really just driven towards improving capital spending and those sorts of things. So the debate is usually around, do we keep doing things with taxes in the general fund or do we go to a user fee program? It, this not be may not be a surprise to you all, but always discussing the advantages, disadvantages. I think again, thinking about the public, they don't maybe understand these things like staff maybe that they're involved in municipal government. But your tax-based system, the advantage of doing that is it's already in place, right? Like the system's in place. We just got to add another penny to the tax, and we're going to fund everything we need. So that's an advantage, right? Um, uh, it's easy to collect. We know we have an operation to collect all that already. It can certainly be sufficient to fund all the services in our program as long as we have the taxes set appropriately. So those are all positive things about kind of continuing the status quo of funding. But on the disadvantage side, it's not equitable, and we can talk about that here in a little bit. But not everybody pays into that program. That contributes to the issues that we have with stormwater. So that's a disadvantage. The other one, as I'm sure all of you are well aware, it's not dedicated. You can't count on that money every year. It could go up, it could go down. You're going to get out competed for things that fire and police and schools and other things that are a little more popular to fund. So that's a disadvantage. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, you still got to say, hey, we got to collect more money, right? And a tax increase is never popular. On the user fee side, ultimately, it's an equitable way to fund the program. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with why it's more equitable. We'll talk about that in a minute. But ultimately, we can tie the level of service that your fee that you're paying to the level of service or the burden you have on the system that the city needs to um, um, to deal with. It's stable and dedicated. So just like water, sewer, wastewater, trash, these other types of utility fees that people are used to paying. We can we know how much is coming in every year. We can plan for that over a 5 or 10 year period and really, create a long-term vision for the program. But also one of the big ones is it incentivizes good practices, right? So if we're like most utilities are based on impervious area, and we want to maybe reduce the amount of impervious area or at least treat it to a greater extent, we can build in systems in the funding process to incentivize those good practices. The disadvantages, brand new program. We got to find a way to bill that, and maybe an existing bill, it may be another way. But there's the startup costs. We talked about the study that's required to do it, the stakeholder process. So there's cost to getting it up off the ground that are certainly disadvantages. So those are kind of the things we talk about when people ask, why should we do one over the other? These are the kind of top line things as a comparison. Here's just, we talk about equity a little bit, and this is just an example I've been using over the years from the city of Lynchburg, Virginia. And so I'm not going to dive into numbers too much, but one of the things we did there was a comparison between, on the left-hand side, if you needed to fund $2 million with tax revenue, here's the land uses that would pay that, right? There's a customer base. So 50% of that was coming out of tax revenue from single-family homes, 16% was coming out of apartments, and 24% of commercial. But obviously, a tax-based system, there was no money coming from tax-exempt properties, right? And so if you know Lynchburg, Virginia, got a big university, Liberty University, um, that's owned by the Falwells, and they have a lot of non-profit church properties around town that aren't paying anything, but certainly have impervious area that contribute to stormwater. So you go over to the right and you say, all right, now we're going to charge all the impervious area in the city, wherever it falls, regardless of what the land use is. Where would the revenue come from? So what you see right away is when you add in the tax exempt properties and charge them based on the impervious area, and then how some of these other things fall, the single family homes were subsidizing the rest of the community by 25%, or more than 25%, because now they're only paying 23%. So that was a big sort of eye opener that we shared with city council and others. And of course, certain property owners didn't like that, but I mean, the rest of the folks saw why there was an equity argument around where the money's coming from and under the runoff is coming off pavement that all of us have. So that's just something to think about if you're trying to demonstrate how these things, the equity can change by looking at different billing system. Rate structure options. So not going to spend a ton of time on this today, but there's really kind of a range of options for different rate structures you may consider. I would say, in the past, a flat fee program was easy to say, hey, it's $5 per parcel, set it and forget it kind of thing. I mean, those are kind of ancient these days. If you're operating in that world still, I would say you'd want to consider updating your rate structure. So the vast majority of folks are in the middle here with a flat fee for residential or single family homes and maybe a tiered rate. And those are the most common things we see these days. But down the bottom where, a decade or two ago, we wouldn't even consider this, but now with the advent of, with GIS and the tools we have, um, charging everybody, every single property and exactly what they've got on the ground, whether it's residential, commercial, whatever, that's more possible these days. So we're seeing some communities go to that process where they just measure all the impervious area everywhere and charge everybody based on, 100 square feet of impervious area, whatever you've got. My counterpoint to that still is you still got to keep that updated over time. And so there's an administrative piece to that, but it is a way that people are going these days. I would say most are still sort of in the middle. Um, just comparison here of just some terminology just to consider. You may see this terminology out there. A lot of people still just say ERU for everything. Um, ERU stands for equivalent residential unit. I like to differentiate these two here to look at single family units. So just a top, high level equivalent residential unit to me is you look at all the residential properties you have. So single family, multifamily, condos, mobile homes, whatever. And we in that case, we would say, oh, they're all the same. They're all going to pay the same regardless of how big or small they are, right? That is certainly one way to do things. There's nothing wrong with that, fully legal, defensible. But you start to get into arguments about, well, that big mansion that's $5 million, why are they paying the same as the little lady that lives in a condo? And so that's where we kind of move over to this SFU method as something that's a little more equitable, and that's called the single family unit method. And in that case, We do an assessment of all the different residential types as what, and base everything on how does it compare to a single family home, right? So we look at a single family home, look at big, small, we look at these other types of residential units and start to charge higher or lower based on how they compare to a single family home. And that's it's a bit more equitable. We see a lot more folks going that way. Again, with the GIS data, as good as it is these days, it's easier to do that. So that's something to consider if you're looking at maybe changing the way you do things, is to go from the ERU to an SFU method. Um, I've alluded to the data. There's lots of data out there. You're going to do that through assessing your aerial photography. For the residential side, you may do a sampling of residential properties throughout the community, and looking at different types and land use and those sorts of things to look at what's a typical residential home. Um, this used to all be done, and still a lot of cases done through manual evaluation, digitizing impervious areas. I think that's still a viable process. But there's also, great tools out there these days, especially if you're in a larger community, to look at just aerial photo interpretation and grabbing that data automatically. The one thing I would just caution on that is to always consider, goes back to what does the public see? And so there can be a lot of errors with those processes. Ultimately, you're still putting eyeballs on every property. And so if folks start to see a depiction of the impervious area in their property and it's not right, and a lot of them have to be fixed, it tends to, create pause in the process. So if you're going to go down that path of using, photo interpretation to extract impervious areas, I'd strongly recommend a good QA/QC process to really clean up that data and make sure it looks right. Uh, and here's just we talk about the sampling of the residential data. So, one of the things I see a lot of is uh, if you have a neighbor that's got a stormwater utilities, just to take their numbers and say, oh, well, we don't need to do anything different. That town just looks just like ours. We're going to use their tiers or their rates or those kinds of things. I think from a legal perspective, you should do this analysis for your local community. And so, as I mentioned on the prior slide about doing an analysis of your residential properties, this is an example of that for an individual community. And it could look different for lots of different communities. So, I strongly suggest basing your rate on an analysis of data in your community, and not just data in adjacent community, because it can cause legal problems down the road if somebody were to question the basis of your program. So I mentioned tiers as well. So again, talking about equity, um, for a long time, most folks are kind of right in the middle where they just every residential property was charged the same regardless of size. I would say nowadays most folks are looking at a tiered program where the bigger house is on the right, and this is just data from one of the communities we have. In this case, say it's more than 5,000 square feet of impervious area, they're paying a little bit more. They go on the left. You got small homes that are much smaller than the typical single family home. They're going to pay a little bit less. And those, it's revenue neutral, right? Because the big ones are going to pay really offset the small ones when you do the statistical analysis. So, but it does help a lot of times with elected officials to have that in their pocket to say, yeah, we don't love this either, but we're going to try to make it more fair so that not everybody's paying, in proportion to what their impact is on the system. Non-residential, probably pretty standard for most folks to understand. It's really based on the actual measured impervious area on your property. So this is your big box store example here. Maybe it's a Walmart. It's got 500,000 square feet of impervious area. They're going to get billed in comparison to that, single family home or your typical residential property. So in this case, the typical residential property had like 2,600 square feet. So you're just taking the total on this box store, dividing it by how many homes, effectively how many homes would fit on that property. In this case, it's 207 units. So they're going to pay 207 times whatever your base charge is. So if the single family home pays $5, this one's going to pay 207 times $5 for that month because it's equivalent to the amount of runoff they're generating. Rate models for these things are not all that complicated. It's really, in most cases, it's kind of a glorified spreadsheet. You're really looking at the total cost of your program, and you sum up all those billing units that you got in your system, and you're dividing it out for how much you need to charge per billing unit to meet that cost. But this is where it gets back to that level of service. What are you choosing? So versus, it's $1 million program, all right, where your customer is going to pay $2 to $3 a month on a rate. As you move up the ladder, the more cost you add to the program, the more everybody's got to pay to fund that program. And so that gets into the cost benefit analysis. All right, if we want to have a level 5 program, now we're going to be spending $5 to $6 a month per customer. That's more than the national average. Do people want to do that, or they want to kind of step down? So once you build that rate model based on all the impervious area, you can kind of tinker with those options and come up with a cost that makes sense. One, know your state law. I think this is very important to understand the state law. There's a lot of, not a lot, but there's programs out there when I look at their rate structures that I'll be honest, I don't know that they're legal if you read the state law. So really make sure you have your legal department look at the state law, and understand how you're charging with your rate structure. But some of the language over here on the left is, reasonable in amount. So that's obviously debatable. What's reasonable? But proportionate share, I think, is a big one. So when you get into debating rate structures, you get council members start to poke and prod about, what if we just exempt these people? What if we cap these people? What if we don't charge churches? I think that you start to add those factors in, you're violating the law on this proportionate share, because you're starting to exempt people that should be paying based on the amount of impervious area. So I'd be really careful about those sorts of things with your program. Um, and ultimately, the state law specifically mentions impervious area as, a thing that you should consider. So just to kind of keep in line with that, I would really probably, that's the most defensible way to do it. So I would stick to that. Credits to state law, and I underline shall. In our state law in Tennessee, it says you shall offer reductions for people that may do best practices on site. So if you don't have a credit program, you should have one. It doesn't have to be very robust. My experience is that they aren't well utilized by customers, because if you think about the scale of the fee, there's the payback on implementing some pond to get a 25% discount or whatever it is it doesn't always add up, but by state law, you got to have one. And so I would have a credit program, and just, scale it based on what you think you want to administer. That's really probably the key there. You don't want everybody coming in for a credit, because you're going to be overwhelmed by applications, but you want to have a place for people that want to have a reduction in their fee, or have done something on their site that deserves one, to be able to apply for one. Billing. Maybe sometimes the most controversial part of the whole process is how we're going to bill. Um, I'd say the IT departments and billing departments tend to be the most oppositional for things. It really comes down to, what are your options? Do you want to put it on an existing bill? So maybe your community has a water and sewer bill, adding another line for stormwater, pretty easy to do. That's always our preferred way to do it. But you can also put it on a property tax bill. If you don't run your own utility, you don't want to set up a brand new billing system, adding it to the annual property tax is a way to go. There's some things to think about here in Tennessee in terms of the way the law is written, and we could talk about that. But you can do all three of these things here. And the last one being a separate stormwater bill, which we don't recommend unless it's last resort, because it's hard to collect a fee that's only got a stormwater fee, and you're going to get arguments from people that say, well, it didn't rain this month, I don't need to pay my stormwater bill. Well, that's not how it works. Well, lastly on this, I would say, public outreach throughout implementation and beyond. So I mentioned, some of the things you should do during the implementation phase to get the word out. You don't want this to be a surprise when it shows up on their bill. So getting the word out to the public as much as possible to reduce those phone calls, because you will get a lot of phone calls when this rolls out. But ways we do that these days, social media, there's maybe public forums like HOA meetings or things you may attend, and do presentations. Utility billing notices, not everybody gets that anymore, but that's still one way. But then I mentioned targeted campaigns for your most impacted customers. But I also would advise, once you've implemented the feed, to continue some kind of public information process to let people know what have they been paying for? What are you accomplishing? A lot of that's done just through signage. People see a sticker on a truck that now says paid for by your stormwater utility. They see a change in the process, or they see a sign on a project. They see it just a change, like, oh, my $4 is now going to that thing. So I think that's I highly recommend that. And also documenting your successes in some kind of annual report. You're already doing an annual report for your MS4 program. Why not add in some things about what your stormwater utility fee accomplished to make sure council understands? The last section is, that's kind of the implementation of a brand new one, but a lot of these things roll into what do you do with an existing program, or what might you think about in terms of keeping your program up to date? So we see a lot of this these days where communities are saying, I've had a program in place for 10 years. We haven't changed our fee. What should we be doing? And so the drivers for doing that, one, a change in regulatory requirements. Maybe there's something new in your MS4 permit that you haven't been doing before that you may want to consider. I'd say that probably the biggest thing is number two is just increase in department responsibilities and no increase in fees. So we're doing more, but we're not collecting enough money. And I'll show an example of how that impacted a community. But the other thing we've seen a lot of in the last few years, especially with the money that folks got from the ARPA funding, is they did a master plan or they did an asset management plan. They did their inventory, and now they have a better sense of what their needs are. And they know they need to spend more money to meet those needs. And so that tends to be a driver for reassessing your program. So this is just a quick case study of Volusia County, Florida that we did. And I just think it looks typical a lot of communities we deal with. They implemented their program way back in 1993 with a $2.50 rate. 13 years went by before they ever touched that rate. And so you think about water and sewer, that would probably never happen, or it doesn't happen like that. It tends to go up more frequently. But in 2006, they raised it. And again, they went another 17 years before they reconsidered looking at their stormwater fees. So very typical. You may be in that same boat. Your programs are in place 5, 10 years, and you should be thinking about what do we need to do to advance it. A couple things I would say if you're going to go through that process. One is to document what you accomplished. I see a lot of questions from the public and council when you go to present like a new fee increase. It's like, what have you been doing? We've been giving you money. I think it's great to highlight the things you've accomplished over that time. Um, you are going to go back and evaluate those services that you've been providing, the costs, so that level of service analysis that we mentioned before, and because you need to establish what that new funding level needs to be and justify what you're doing. We still use our matrix, and a lot of times we look at how that's changed over time. So in this case, it was back in the 2006 when we looked at this for Volusia County, and this is where they were at, kind of a C-level program at the time in most of the categories with really no capital. And if you look at, with those accomplishments that we talked about, what have they done? And so one of the things we used for them was this maintenance practice evaluation that they had done by another consultant to look at what their maintenance program was doing. And it really highlighted how their program had increased, it had changed over time. And so one of the key things we talked about is like the population increased, the assets increased, but really their labor budget had decreased through that period of time. They weren't charging overtime, but they were getting more work done because they had an asset management program that was allowing them to do more things efficiently. So it was a really good case study of how they've gotten better, but also that they still had needs to continue moving forward. And that's really kind of the crux of one of the reasons why they were looking at reevaluating their fee. So kind of redid their matrix and said, all right, well, planning's kind of the same, CIP is kind of the same, but really they really ramped up was their compliance and their O&M activities. And so we showed improvement, but it was like, hey, we need to do a little bit more. And in their case, they had a master plan done over that time, and they knew they had additional 30 million in capital to spend, and they had some additional TMDL requirements. So that ended up being the driver for what their future needs of their program was, and they really needed to ramp up capital in order to meet those needs. So those are the kinds of things to think about with your program. Like what is that key thing that you want to say is why we got to look at our raising the fee of our program, even though it's been the same for a long time. They can also take a look at how you compare to your peers. And so a lot of times when this is a graph from TNSA from a couple of years ago, but start to look at, where do you sit? Are you on the low end of the scale? Are you on the high end of the scale? A lot of times, for the elected officials, they just want to be around the peers that they are. And so if they see they're a couple dollars below, they're kind of more open to, hey, let's move up at least to the average of everybody around us. Now, if you're way on the other end and you're on the high side, it's probably a harder argument to say you need to do more, but it's a good thing to look at what everyone else is paying. And so there's lots of resources out there, and I'm gonna highlight a couple here at the end to get that data. And really, one of the last things I'd say that tends to be a driver for updating these, but also a caution for if you got a new program, is how do you keep the billing data up to date? I'd say this is probably the number one biggest thing we run into with communities is how have they been keeping the program up to date? And so, um, typically, even when we implement the program, we have a document, like a process and procedures document that lays out what everyone's supposed to be doing, who's responsible when it's done. But the reality is there's often not a dedicated person at a community that's doing that. And so things tend to fall behind, and there's lost revenue related to that. And so a lot of this update process is trying to look back into the history of what's been forgotten, what's not been mapped or identified, and then getting it up to speed so you're collecting all the revenue you should be collecting, and then reestablishing, what are the new processes and procedures to make sure that they don't fall behind again. So I would say this is one thing that a lot of communities experience and something you need to pay attention to. But the result of that assessment, I think this is from, the Volusia project. A couple things we got out of that study was one, confirming the value of the program. And so, documenting all those successes that they had and making sure people understood that, that it was a successful, well-run program. This wasn't to come in and say they weren't doing a good job. But one, looking at what an assessment of what they needed to continue to provide that level of service into the future. So that really, this process of updating their program really facilitated that and informed the public and the elected officials. And ultimately, um, in that case, if you remember, they were at about $6, and the recommendation out of the report was to go to like $8.50 a month. But we showed some higher level of service, and they had uh, universal approval around the 850, and a couple council members were saying, well, we said we needed, they're saying we might need 12. Like, should we go even higher than that so we don't fall behind again? So it was really successful to kind of go through that process, make sure everyone understood what the challenges were and what the future needs were to gain that support. So just some closing thoughts before we open up to questions. I always, number one's important, do your homework on your community. Every community is different. I would never tell you to just look at your neighbor and do what they did because your needs might be different. Um, Sell the service before selling the fee. If you can't tell the story about what the services you need to provide and what the benefits of those are, you're not going to be successful in charging somebody a new fee. I think that stakeholder effort is really important. If you're in a community where you think it's going to be contentious and you don't know which way it's going to go, it's a great way to build trust and educate the public. Um, Also, just make sure you understand what the hot buttons are for everybody, so you don't have somebody coming in at the last minute and throwing a wrench in the process. And understand what I mentioned the friends and enemies thing. Make sure you know what everyone's opinion is, and try to address those before you ever get to a vote. And then lastly, as I just touched on, really having a clear process of how to maintain and update your impervious area in your billing system, whether you got an existing program today or you're looking to update it. I really reinforce that people lose a lot of revenue in that world, and you really want to kind of nail that down and have folks responsible for that. So with that, I will wrap up and thank you for your time, and I am happy to answer as many questions as you have.
And you do have some questions that are in chat, David.
Okay, let's see if I can get to them. Uh, okay, all right. Let's just scroll down here. Let's see. Sorry. just I'm seeing comments so far.
Oh, I thought you had a couple questions. Maybe I'm.
And it might be. I'm out.
Oh, okay, okay.
There was something, I guess Johnny had a question about cap on credits for an individual bill. Yeah, yeah, when we do credits, again, they're not exemptions. Um, you get people say, well, I have a pond, I don't contribute. I should pay zero if I have a pond. And like, no, every property benefits from the broader management of the program. And so we tend to tie the percentage reduction to what maybe category of those four uh, are, how those impact the total cost of the program. So for example, it's like if you have a pond and you reduce the amount of runoff leaving your system, maybe the city has smaller pipes downstream. Maybe the city's regional pond's smaller. Those are probably capital investments. So if the capital part of your program is 30% of your program, well, then the fee for that pond can only be 30% max, right? That may be a way to tie it together so that, because that program's still benefiting from all the maintenance that when they drive to work every day, when they take their kids to school, they're benefiting from the maintenance of the system. They're benefiting from their MPDS compliance. So what they do on their site isn't offsetting that cost, so they shouldn't get 100% reduction. I think that answer your question.
Yeah, when we were getting all this started, I think the folks that were talking about this said they recommended that you cap the amount that of fee reduction that anybody could get at no more than 50%.
Yeah. Yeah. Our thing is we don't want to make it arbitrary, right? So the we do spend a lot of time talking about the cost of the program and the benefits. So when you talk about a credit, it should go against what you're benefiting the program at large. And so we try to tie it to some percentage of the program cost so that there's a defensible thing. 50 is a number, but it's kind of arbitrary, right? So we try to tie
Well,
it to that so it's defensible.
you would use defensible logical methods to come up with the amount
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
would reduce their fee by up
Yep.
to that cutoff point.
Yeah. And now for sure there's outliers to that. And you get in a community with like one large major property owner that, has already made a massive investment and, there can be other sort of one-off negotiations, but as a policy standpoint, we usually try to tie those, but we definitely put caps on the credits so that you can't just offset your entire fee unless you don't discharge to the system anymore, then maybe we would consider it. But Steven, still, like I said, your employees benefit from the system, you benefit. You mentioned you had a comment about leveraging through bonds. Yeah, we didn't get into a lot of the financing piece, but that certainly builds into the rate calculation. Um, let's see. Have you looked at national data collection for this? I'm not sure exactly what where that was referred to.
Western
National.
Western Kentucky University does I think it's
Yeah,
annual review of stormwater utilities all through the United States. I think in Canada as well. So that technically international
yeah,
database.
yeah. And I kind of
But it
brushed it at the end. Yeah, Western Kentucky, I mentioned earlier, it's a great resource for a lot of data. On this slide, I got up here a couple other really good resources if you're considering this. Southeast Stormwater Utility Report. If you're a member, you probably know about this, but it's a great survey and has also got a lot of information about various rate structures and credits and revenue. Um, but the two other ones from a process standpoint, if you're just like going down the path and you want a guidebook, I had the pleasure of co-authoring both of the in parts of both of these, but WEF has a user fee funded stormwater program manual. It's a big book and it kind of documents the process for implementing utility, and it's got case studies of, and I mentioned Raleigh's in there. And then also APWA down the bottom, they've got more of a kind of a smaller guidebook, but financing stormwater utility guidebook. Those are just good references if you just sort of want a document to roadmap where your process should be. State revolving loan funds. Yes, I mentioned, kind of mentioned leveraging other funds to, augment your program are great. So that maybe your fee might be a little bit less. Okay, it says, does a fee mean a standalone department or at least a stormwater fund managed by an existing department, other towns where it's just another fund? Yeah, so multiple ways to do it. I would say a lot of folks, when they implement the fee, it's just a fund, dollars come into a fund and they're transferring those dollars to offset whatever was being spent in the general fund on those various processes. And then as the program matures, I've seen a lot of them migrate into maybe their own standalone department. I mentioned Lynchburg before, like this was back during like EPA's kind of one water approach. So they ended up merging water, wastewater, stormwater all into one program, and it's like the water resource department. So it can depend, but I would say most of the communities, when we were talking about those 15 to 20,000 population communities, they tend to just collect the fee and then enterprise fund and then pay for the services through that rather than restructuring their whole department. It's just more cost that way. And so until they mature in their program, they tend to not do that. Able doesn't speak to that. And then just John's comment, enabling legislation. Okay. There's a question here. Have you adjusted fees based on provided SCM? So you're speaking to the credits there. So, yes, as I mentioned, if they've got, uh, facilities to reduce, either improve water quality or reduce the volume leaving your site, we'd certainly want to offer credit. I think the biggest question we have there is, do you offer credit for something that's required? So maybe your local ordinance says you need to have 1 inch capture. We all know this requirement, right? So you got to have this device on your site to capture the first inch of runoff. Do you then give them a credit for that? I would argue no. I would say that that was already required. All of our planning and modeling that we may do from a master planning perspective assumes that you've done that. So we're not going to give a credit for that because we've assumed it's there. But if you did, instead of 1 inch, you did 1.5, well, then I would give you credit for that. Now, the flip side of that, get back to the politics side of it, which is a part of all this. Council members get the complaint. I already have a pond. I do this. I do that. Oftentimes we end up crediting it. It's just a much lower percent. You can only get 10% if we were going to credit your device that's out there. But if you go above and beyond, we're going to give you 30%. So that's usually the way we handle that. Let's see. Sorry, this is covered up here. What if it's
So in
infiltrate?
Tennessee,
Yeah. What? Sorry, what's that?
I was gonna say, so in Tennessee, you are required to have a credit program, some kind of
Yes.
credit program.
The law says you shall have a opportunity to reduce. It doesn't mention credit program. It says you shall have a provide opportunities to reduce the fee for, doing something on site. So I take that as you have to have a credit program.
It sounds like it opens you up for a lot of headaches as far as, like you said, but I'm
It,
friends with the mayor, or but I did this,
yeah,
and
you would think we spent a lot of time talking about credits. And then I always use Memphis as an example. When we did that, there were 300,000 accounts in Memphis. 5 years later, I think they had 9 credits. Um, I mean, so
yeah,
like everybody complains, you got to have a credit, got to have a credit, got to have a credit, and then they don't want to fill out the application. They don't want to hire an engineer to get to the calculate. Like, so it 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 tends to not be a burden unless you just open it wide open. Like some people are like, oh, we want to get into green infrastructure. We want to credit rain barrels. And then you could probably have a headache on your hands. So we tend to limit it to
just keep it
non-residential
general.
properties. And yeah, yeah. What if it's an infiltration practice? I think it's kind of alluding to basically if you're not discharging off site, then maybe you're not a burden on the system. And that kind of goes back to my statement before is yes, that may benefit a portion of your overall program, um, but if you're still using the streets and the roads and everything else, you're benefiting from the broader management system. I'd say the biggest question we get related to that is I'm sitting on the Tennessee River. My runoff from my property goes into the river. I shouldn't pay you a nickel. Yeah, you should have a reduced fee, and we have a process for that, but you still benefit from the broader management of the system, and so you don't get exempt. And that's we try to stick to that argument. Usually okay, but we have to provide an avenue for them to get a reduction, for that. Gets into the one you spend a lot of time talking about the onesies and twosies instead of like the 95% of the properties. Yeah, I mentioned that with the credit stuff. Can lower the fee by can lower your fee by reducing impervious area. Yeah, so that we call it a credit and adjustment manual. So credits being you did something to reduce the fee, you reduce the impervious area, you obviously have less footprint. You can apply, appeal your fee and get a reduction there. I think that's it here. And that's in the chat. So any specific questions from the audience that you have, if you want to speak up?
All right.
All right. Well,
No,
yeah, my contact information on there.